Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. We're so excited here at Spring Park to be hosting Marie Wilson, sharing with us her experiences with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on Epiquet, part of the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which recognize the Mi'kmaq title and establish the ongoing relationship between the Mi'kmaq Nation and the Crown. We are all treaty people. And I'd like to ask Elder Judy Clark to come for a welcome for us.
Kwe. Nina dalwisi sudik, hakaktiko sisi baby, awabe gipu David, in Chile dahpola de Epiquet. So, welcome. My name is Judy Clark. I am Mi'kmaq, and I am from the Abiquitt First Nation. I am very honored to be here, and I met Marie just a few minutes ago. I did a smudge for her, and I also made a comment that Nora Bernard was my cousin, and she was from Nova Scotia, and she was the one who started the class action suit, the largest in Canada, and it resulted in the TRC. And I want to acknowledge and welcome Marie to our territory. And I want to sing by honoring her the honor song. The honor song was made by one of the elders from Iskanovidich, and it's in 4 rounds, and it says that we all need to work together, and what Creator put us on this earth for, and that is to work together. And so basically that's what it is. It's a little bit more, but that's the gist of it. Getting me dead a minute, Don Telio Nukti, Nikamacho, came out Getting me dead a minute, Don Better Big Salty. Tahoe, and Sidnogma, all my relations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Elder Judy. My name is Kathy Bixby. I'm a member here at Spring Park Church, and I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors. So Spring Park Church. I'm also the chair of the Justice Mission and Outreach Committee for this region of the United Church of Canada, and we are sponsors of the event. We also have generous sponsorship from the Faculty of Indigenous Knowledge, Education and Applied Studies at UPEI. Thank you so much to them. The Council of Canadians is also sponsoring the Women of First Light and Spring Park Church. For any of you who are here specifically to see Senator Brian Francis, too bad, you're in too deep. Something about the king coming tomorrow, and he had the rug pulled out from under him, so you get me instead. But we were really we really appreciate that he was wanting to participate. I'm going to, you get me instead. My colleague, Mark Nicol, is going to introduce Marie.
Drop thing. I met Marie in church, Yellowknife United Church to be exact, in the fall of 1990 when my wife Sandy and I and our son Brendan moved to Yellowknife. And our kids with Kyla, and I remember particularly at that time in Sunday school, and we had a talent auction once, and you and Stephen offered a sawtooth feast at their beautiful home on Latham Island. And we went there, and I don't remember all the things we had, but I remember with our friends Catherine and Earl, and just course after course of just amazing food and music and another thing. And another talent auction, or maybe it was the same one, my friend Steve and I, you bought us, because I think you said one thing that, different Steve, your Stephen didn't learn in residential school was how to be handy. So Steve McCrae and I came over, and I think we tore down an outbuilding or something near your house. So that was the kind of memories of it. Oh, and something about a work bee at the manse, and you were working with me to install vinyl flooring in the kitchen. So, you know, in case you ever run out of things to do, you've got that skill to back on. So here we are back at church, and I loved one of your quotes from Peter Short. That was, we give thanks for the gift of this day and the grace that has brought us safely to it. Back to hear from you again. And as it says in your book jacket, you spent 6 years as a commissioner with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You've spoken across North America, Europe, Asia, New Zealand on the potential of reconciliation. You were born in Ontario, you've lived, studied, and worked as a journalist, teacher, professor, trainer, and executive in Canada, France, Burkina Faso, South Africa, and parts of South America. And you now live in the lovely Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Am I on? Is this mic on? Yes, it is on. Can you hear me? I asked to speak from here, not because I intend to preach, nor do I want to. I just want to make sure I can see all of you. And I also don't want to fall up or down the stairs, having to go up them more times than necessary. So thank you very much for welcoming me here to your space and your city and Mi'kmaq. It was great to be welcomed in a sacred way by Elder Judy, and also to have the beautiful honor song. Thank you so much for that. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. with my new friend, Kathy, whom you know well, but also to be introduced by an old friend. And it's one of the great gifts of touring around with a book, as it turns out. How would I know? I'd never done it before. But I've met up again with old friends from various places, some of whom I had lost track of and didn't actually know where they were anymore. And that has been true, and I would say the biggest two threads have been United Church friends and also CBC Radio-Canada friends who scatter and spread all over the country, and here I am now going around picking up those threads of acquaintance, and it's been really an enrichment. Since you talk about that talent auction, we called it a talent auction, it was a fundraiser. I remember those ones, and I also remember one where I had brought my late mother's delicious apple pie recipe, which is kind of now one of the legacy culinary things in our family. My daughters now know how to make it well. She was really great at it, and I was known to be quite good at it. However, also really busy and not a frequent baker. So it was kind of a big deal when you had fresh pie. And so I made those for my talent auction. And there was this bidding that went on and on and on, and only after a while, because those running the auction were at the front. Those of us who had brought things were sitting, with our backs to the room, paying attention to the front. And somebody from the back kept bidding up these apple pies over and over again. And only well into it, when it was like so far beyond what it was worth, did we all turn around and start laughing. It was my own husband who was bidding. So it was Stephen wanting those pies. It was, I think, the bid was one thing, the lesson and the hint was another, So it's great. Thank you for reminding me of that. I also just want to say a word, if I may, about Senator Brian Francis. I'm only slightly insulted that he chose the King over me. But I want you to know what a fervent supporter he has been of this work. Maybe you know that here, but I know it because I've seen him in many parts of the country where he's been able to go in his role, and I've overlapped with him many times in Ottawa. And, we've never, ever lived or worked in the same place, but I've presented in front of committees where he is part of the committee, and I feel when I see him anywhere in any context in Ottawa or elsewhere, like it's a reunion of old friends. So you should be very pleased with the strong advocacy that he brings on behalf of this region. And I hope you are supporting him equally by being part of the work that he's trying to do and making sure that you're being part of that. So I served, as I think you all know, as one of the three commissioners. There were three of us, the late Justice Murray Sinclair, who was our chair, and my co-commissioner colleague, Chief Dr. Wilton Littlechild. Both of them are from Western Canada, different part, well, so one Central Canada from Manitoba was Murray, and Willie is from Maskwacis between Edmonton and Calgary, that may be more familiar markers too. That's where his home region is. And the three of us, in a way, were kind of a perfect combination in that Willie himself was also a residential school survivor. He went to residential schools for many years. And Murray was the child of residential school survivors and was raised by a very devout Catholic grandmother because his mother died when he was really small. And he was raised by his grandparents, and his grandmother was a very devout practicing Catholic. And then I was there, as it turned out, as the spouse of a residential school survivor. So each of us brought quite a different perspective, none of which was on our job descriptions or on our CVs. It just so happened, as we were getting to know each other and kind of properly introducing ourselves to each other, that we realized that we had this, I think, really rich mix of perspectives on the question of both the experience of residential schools and the legacy of them as they have continued to play out within families and across generations. So those two being lawyers, one of them a judge, myself being a journalist, it was also a different set of professional skills and experiences that we brought. So I think we rounded each other out in a good way. Well, why were we commissioners and why did we even have a commission in Canada? Some of you will know that background history very well, but others may not know the nuances, and the nuances are some of the most essential pieces of information. And that is that it was not Canada who set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We always think of commissions as being government appointed. This one was not. We applied for the job. And it was also not set up by Canada because Canada decided to do that. It was set up by Canada, indeed, because the courts ordered Canada to set it up, because there was a massive court case, and it's right for us to name Nora Bernard, who was the warrior and champion in this region, and there were a number of regional class actions initially, and there were champions and regional champions in class actions in northern Canada around a very notorious school called Grolier Hall. There was a class action around notorious activity at the Mush Hole in southern Ontario, known as the Mohawk Institute, and that was, and as well as in Muncie outside of London, Ontario, and that class action was led by Chief Cloud. In southern Ontario, there was another led by Willie Blackwater in BC, and so on. So to make the point that all these little class actions, then finally, for reasons of expediency and cost, but also so that the survivors, many of whom were very elderly already, would have some chance of seeing some resolution of their claims while they were still with us. And so it became this massive national class action, as Judy has said. And one of the things that they insisted on when it was settled out of court was that, okay, if we're not going to have our day in court, we have to have our day somewhere. Where will our stories be heard, and where will they be recorded, and where will they be safeguarded for future reference and for posterity, and as a bulwark against deniers, either internally or externally, either now or in the future, who want to pretend that this didn't happen in Canada, or that it wasn't as bad as people say it was, or that children didn't die, or any of those things that people try to put forward as a new version of truth. And so the hearings that we did were really the core of our work in some ways. It wasn't the only thing. We had to oversee a massive commemoration fund. We had to support and assist an undefined number of community events, which ended up being over 300. And we had to organize what were called 7 national events. And I think, Mark, you were referring to the one in Edmonton, which was the 7th of those 7. And we also had with us, and we didn't choose them, it wasn't our bright idea, it was those people who negotiated our mandate who said, we need to have a survivors advisory committee working with you and walking with you. So we had from this region, Milder Lottie Mae Johnson, and she was she's from Eskasoni, and I saw her just last week. She's still doing what she can as a much more elderly person. And we had survivor advisors from throughout the country. But again, one of the first challenges is 7 national events, 13 jurisdictions. Where do you hold them? And how do you hold them in a way that doesn't create further offense, but that also makes it as possible for as many people to attend as possible. And I'm sure several of you are probably involved in fundraising efforts to support transportation for survivors to attend the event in this region, which was held in Halifax. But anyway, the work that we did carried on. It was a 5-year mandate. We ended up being extended for a year because we had to go back to court. because the government and some of the church entities did not want to release to us the documents that they were obligated by the court ruling to release to us. And so we had to go back to court and fight that fight and say, you know, when we read in our mandate that you have to release all relevant documents, we think that means all relevant documents and not just the ones you feel like giving us. And the courts ruled in our favor, but court procedures are long, and that took a year, and we lost a year of time. But we won in the end, and we won the point that in this story, the government and the churches were not the heroes. We won the point that the survivors were the heroes of this story. They were the Davids to the Goliaths, and they made their point, and the courts ruled, yes, you have just cause. And so when we went back to court, we did get that ruling, and then the additional 6 months at the end. So we were supposed to wrap in mid-year 2015. We wrapped in, 2014. We wrapped in mid-year 2015. And then we had a further 6-month expansion because all of the documents had not been translated into French. And we had an obligation for the 2 official languages. We also wanted to have things done in as many Indigenous languages as possible. And so we used that extra 6 months to really work around the country and try to let faith communities, governments, municipalities, schools, universities, athletic organizations, the media, let them know where they fit into the calls to action and what they might take on doing and what their job was. And I think about that because that was not strategic planning on our part. That really was, I'll just say, that was intervention from somewhere else that said, okay, you've got this extra time. What we did, which was our work, is we stood up against the government when the government said, well, okay, you've got your report, so let us just take that on and we'll get it translated and then we'll release it later. And we said, oh no. You don't get to turn yourselves into the ones in charge of this. This was an independent commission. It was accountable. We always said we were accountable to the survivors who paid for it out of their court earnings, out of their settlement monies, and that is our accountability. And so the only option is extend us. Some of us were on a part-time basis. Murray was full-time for an additional 6 months, and that's what allowed us to really get the word out there. What do we do with this 6 months? Let's spread the word and tell people what those calls to action mean and where they fit in. It will be 10 years next week, I think, if I've got the week after. June 2nd is the actual date that we released the 94 calls to action. But this entire year is an anniversary year, as well as it is also an important United Church of Canada anniversary year. But in December is when we released our 6-volume final report and all of the translated versions and so on. So it's a really useful year as we remind ourselves of all of those sacred frames within which we have lived, to also remember sacred promises we have made. In the House of Commons, the apology will have been 17 years on June 11th. 17 years. So I frequently say this when you're talking to all your members of Parliament and so on, remind them of that anniversary and maybe send them a copy of the apology that their leader uttered in the House of Commons and remind them of that commitment to ongoing work. Well, it was an extraordinary event, and I'll just say one last thing, and then I would like to read you a little excerpt before we start our conversation, and that is, I decided to write a book, not because I wanted to become an author, but because I didn't want the story to die. And I know that 10 years later, one of the challenges we face, I see it right here in front of me, is we are an aging population of those who lived through the commission and who got to learn. And we need to make sure that we are leaving tools for the younger generation and the next generation to also know what happened, but also to not forget it and to take up their responsibilities to stewarding that story, just as we do with Remembrance Day and with the sacrifices that were made in war times and and those who did not return from battlefields. And so too it was for children who did not return from school in our own country because of policies not set in place by boards of education, but by the government and by people who were not their parents or family and who suffered great consequences. So how would I help keep this story alive? I thought the best thing I can offer as my contribution is to take people to retrace my steps as a commissioner and to take people along where I went in all of those, yes, difficult moments at times, but extremely uplifting moments, many hilariously funny moments that would surprise you, and inspirational moments, truly inspirational moments, and sometimes poetic moments in the way people expressed themselves and shared their reflections. And today, in particular, I want to talk about the issue of reconciliation, because we always struggle with that and what does it mean. And in retracing the steps of the Commission, I used as the milestone markers those national events that I told you about. And so we started off with the theme of respect. Then we went to, and that was in Manitoba. We then went to the far north with the theme of courage in Inuvik. Then we moved here to Halifax with the theme of love. And from there we moved to Saskatoon for truth. We moved back east to Montreal for humility. We went to Vancouver for honesty. And we ended in in Edmonton with wisdom. We had a major opening event before that. We had a major closing event at the back end of that. And then in between the last national event and the closing, we had a gathering with traditional knowledge keepers from all the nations across the country that we had encountered to ask them to help us explore the meaning of reconciliation, to help us offer words to go forward with about what that means. So that is how I have structured the book. And I want to refer to this particular page. So you'll see each section has its own section. Each section also has a color, a black and white photo, and it has a quote, an inspirational quote. And all of them are from an Indigenous elder named Dave Cruikshank, Elder Dave Cruikshank Jr., and the teachings of the 7 sacred teachings, except for this one where I'm introducing the Commission itself. And there, the quote that I chose to use is from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the chair of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what he says is, differences are not intended to separate, to alienate. We are different precisely in order to realize our need of one another. And so I thought that was a good way to set out the whole journey and then to kind of focus down on each of the teachings along the way. So let me just read this little excerpt. And this is from, it happens to come, it's not for any reason other than it's what spoke to me today. Oh, I've got the wrong tab. Here we are. This happened to be in this section that is in Quebec, so the teaching was humility, and the title, each section has two chapters, except for the North, which got 3 because I had more to say about my family and everything. So this one is called Embracing the Mother Load. On most hearing days, a few clergy from various denominations would be present, usually representative of the church or churches that ran schools in the region where hearings were happening. Typically, their seminaries or theological schools had taught them nothing about their church's history running residential schools and the associated harms, just as most of us were typically taught nothing about residential schools in our own schooling. So now we've got the ill-informed as the spiritual leaders of the ill-informed. That's what we have as a result of that. Now, in showing up to listen to survivors, these clergy were learning stark truths and hearing heavy burdens for what individuals from their Christian traditions had done or allowed to happen to generations of children. At one such hearing in Quebec, after repeated accounts of sexual predation, a priest made a statement to the commission, but addressed the heart of it to survivors. In a voice of quiet outrage and shame, he said, "If I were in your shoes, I don't think I would like priests, nuns, or ministers either. What happened to you is unspeakable, unacceptable, vulgar, indecent." I felt his words as a broken lament of betrayal from one who had devoted his life to Christian teachings of goodness, kindness, and love, the same teachings I had learned from many spiritual traditions over the years, including my own Christian upbringing. In childhood, I always liked this particular Bible reading from Isaiah 11:6. "In that day, the wolf and the lamb will live together. The leopard and the goat will be at peace. Calves and yearlings will be safe among lions, and a little child will lead them all." It resonated with me then. I liked this image of the child as the one leading for a change. You know how it is when you're little, you think you're in charge of absolutely nothing, and here it was. My commissioner colleague, Chief Willie, relates even more personally to this particular verse because of his last name, Little Child. At one of our many light-hearted commissioner dinners, where we often laugh to lift our spirits up and take care of each other, he told Murray and me that his name had even helped him get elected as a member of Parliament. In campaign debates, he would get the last word and the last laugh by declaring that even the Bible was on his side and quoting, "A little child will lead them all." Like today's challenge of reconciliation, that passage describes a new state of being, the coming together of perceived adversaries, the opposing powers of predator and prey, perpetrator and victim, in harmonious coexistence. From the earliest days of the TRC, we talked about reconciliation as being about respect. I often added that reconciliation also means change. How else to upend the current state of inequity? And from there, reconciliation also means peace. Peace in the hearts of individuals, peace in families, communities, country. Peace not as the opposite of war, but as the opposite of social dysfunction, cultural disintegration, and spiritual collapse. And always with children at the center, showing the way, leading us all.
We good to go here? Thank you so much for that. I find whenever I've had the opportunity to hear an author do a reading, I go back and read and I hear their voice, and it really feels different. So that was very nice to have. As you mentioned, most of us didn't know much about this. We didn't learn it at school, but you didn't go into this not knowing. You had a background that gave you lots of credentials to participate, you knew. But I think there were surprises for you through this process. Could you talk about what some of those surprises were and unexpected discoveries?
So, before I could say what I was going to say, I was about to tell you I have this cough. um, and I have lozenges in my pocket, and I've been all cough syruped up, so I hope I'll be okay. Thanks to Mario. I hope it didn't have codeine in it, because I don't want to drift off while I'm sitting up here. But I do apologize in advance if I cough. I'll just try to contain myself. I was sick, and I have been medicated, and I was seen again by a doctor 2 days ago, because I don't want you all fretting. I also don't want you to think I'm spewing germs all over the place, because I've been A-okayed that I'm fine. I just have this thing. So sorry for that. There were so many discoveries, and it's a good question. But I would say what I knew generally is something that I think any of us who are paying attention have known generally, which is something's off. Something's off when we see such disproportionate numbers of Indigenous individuals in every negative marker of our society. Something's off. I think what we haven't always understood is why things are the way they are, and we certainly have not understood or been able to be honest about we're part of the reason why things are the way they are. Whether we've been told that, whether we've been taught that, whether we've been attuned to that, whether we've been honest about that or not. And I mean that in terms of our systems, our institutions, our attitudes, and our kind of quiet prejudices that have made us feel comfortable with privileging certain people and avoiding opportunity for others. I think one of the most surprising things for me, though, overall, well, I'll say one more thing about that. I knew a lot more as we went along in my life, but in my marriage, I was married for 15 years before I knew what had happened to my husband. So I think part of the reason we didn't know was, number one, we weren't taught it, but also we were not publicly talking about it. And in our families, a lot of young Indigenous people came forward and wanted to learn because they knew something was wrong, but they didn't know why in their own families. Because the pain of talking about it was so much, people didn't want to talk. Because the shame of talking about it was so much. And because the desire of parents not to hurt their children by telling them difficult things. So all those, but at the core of it was for so many children when they were children, thinking that what happened was their fault. And they were the ones who kind of either deserved this or were bad or whatever. It's one of the things my husband always refers to is he didn't talk about it because he was ashamed of what happened because he had been told so clearly and repeatedly that he was the bad kid. So I knew certainly more than your average person. I was also a journalist, so I covered lots of stories, but things didn't present as being residential school legacy stories. Things presented as being about crime or about addiction or about dysfunction or about poverty, but without connecting the dots. And I think that is one of the things that the TRC helped us begin to be able to do as a country is to connect the dots, which is why we called for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women as one of our calls to action. It's why we called for additional work to try to find the missing children as one of our calls to action. It's why we called for jury reform so that Indigenous people could be reflected on juries where their own citizens were being assessed and what's the word I'm looking for? Tried for different things. and had been missing from all the jury considerations for so long. Those were all things, they're not different things, that's what I'm saying. Sometimes I think we hear about this and we think, oh God, now what? Oh, now what? They're all the same thing. It's not now what, it's what else. You know, how does it fit together? And at what point do we stop and realize these are way bigger things and we need to look at a bigger picture of what systemically do we need to change and shift if we want to have, if we are sincere in saying we want to have a different outcome. But the last thing I'll say to your very important question, Kathy, is one of the biggest things that I learned was the unbelievable capacity for forgiveness in the communities that we went into. People who were trying so hard to live in the present and imagine a better future. I went in honestly at times expecting I should be wearing a hard hat because I'm going to really receive it, especially as the one non-Indigenous commissioner. And I was never received with anything but love and respect and kindness. You know, that was me putting that on as a fearful projection, and it was not what happened. And so, at one of the hearings, I remember it was a clergy member saying, "I have seen rituals and practices around forgiveness for all my professional life in the clergy, and I have never witnessed the degree and depth of forgiveness that I have seen in these hearings." So that was a happy surprise. Yeah.
Thank you for that. You were a journalist. Well, so what do journalists do? They get the truth, right? Get the story, get the truth. That was part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission too, but it was a different process and a different path to getting the truth. I'm interested in your reflections on how this was different, and did you feel like you got to the truth?
Well, those are different questions, and both of them really big. I'll do the last one first because in some ways it's simpler. I think we got to some truths. I think we got to some level of truth. I think truth-telling is not a finite job. It's an ongoing job. And I tell the story in one of the chapters in the book, even about one of the survivors who wanted to give a statement. And then some number of weeks later, we were in a different community, we being I, because I happen to be the presiding commissioner, which is why I know the story well. Sometimes we were all together, the commissioners, and sometimes we spread out because we had to cover more ground. And this particular region of the country I was presiding, this person came forward, gave a statement. It was a very compelling statement. It was a very beautiful statement. And then a couple of weeks later, I was somewhere else in the province, and I'm looking around the room, and there's somebody lined up to speak, people registered in line, not lined up in a line, but I mean, they registered in order. And I recognized this person. But by then, we've been all over the country, and I'm doing that thing you do, like, where do I know that guy from? Like, I know I've seen that face before, where do I know him from? And I couldn't place it. And then he sat down at the table and started talking. And I recognized his story. I recognized the front end of his story, which he restated. And he had such a particularly beautiful and poetic way of speaking that it was really memorable. But he had just this calm tone, and he was kind of talking to me, but I could tell he was kind of talking to himself. And he added some things that he hadn't said the first time. So that too was truth, but it was a different level of truth. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, whatever it was, there I was in yet another community, each one getting, interestingly, farther and farther away from a big urban center. So he had obviously traveled long distance to follow the commission, and there he was again, and there I was again. And by this time, I did recognize him. I remembered his name, and he spoke again. I thought, what is coming? And I'll just say he had worked up to the thing that he really wanted to say and that he really wanted to set down. And he shared that as also truth, but a deeper layer of truth. And I think people can't just come in and do a truth dump. You know, people who are on healing journeys, anybody who's been involved in counseling, and many of you do pastoral care, like, it's hard for people to see themselves. It's hard to dig down in, and sometimes things can't be said all at one time. So this was an example where things were coming out. But I could also see the country on a journey of truth-telling as we saw more and more people showing up. I'm trained as a journalist. What you expect there is there's a big flash at the beginning, it's a big story, and then it peters out. And whether that's right or wrong, whether that's what you want or not, that's what happens. And here was this story traveling around the country, and not by the power of anything any one of three commissioners said, but by the power and impact of what survivors were saying, which was so incredibly riveting and eye-opening and heart-opening. More and more people were showing up. So I think I actually say that in the book. When we had our first national event, there were about 40,000 people over the first 4 days, and about 10% of those were non-Indigenous people. And by the time we were in Winnipeg, Edmonton at the last national event, I keep wanting to say Winnipeg because I associate the W of wisdom with Winnipeg, but it was Edmonton. There were about the same, like it was a huge turnout, 40,000 people. That's a lot of people. And about 60% were non-Indigenous people who were, you know, you could see, it's like a flower kind of opening in that way. And I haven't used that analogy before, and I don't want to be glib about it. But since I'm onto it, let me just say where we are right now is, you know, flowers open and then they dry out and drop off. And that is what we cannot allow to happen, you know, is that we are opened up to this really essential story that is not a chapter in our history. It is a ribbon running through our entire history as a country. I love being in these eastern parts of Canada where you see the big old buildings. I saw one on the way here, and the building itself was from 1860. I think it was Trinity United Church building is what I think it was. Mario can correct me, but I think that was the date I saw, 1860, which is pre-Confederation, right? And there were residential schools pre-Confederation. The oldest one was the Mohawk Institute outside of Brantford, Six Nations Reserve, which the children called the Mush Hole. And it started running in the 1830s and ran continuously till the 1970s. So that's more than a chapter in our history as a country. That is a bedrock piece of our history as a country. And we have to decide whether that's the kind of foundation we want to continue forward on, or we're going to find a way to hoist ourselves up and change the footing and go forward differently. I think that's part of the ongoing work. So I've talked around such a circle, I forget what your original question was, so back to you.
No, that's just fine. On the subject of reconciliation, I'm going to go out on a limb here. When I contacted the CBC locally, what I heard back was, you know, this is in the future, we'll see. By the way, we know that some of the calls to action are specifically addressed to the CBC, directed to the CBC rather. But as the event got closer, there seemed to be not very much interest. And I know that's not true with CBC everywhere. But where I'm going with this is I think a lot of us here are worried about the whole drive for reconciliation, maybe feeling like old news. And you talk in the book about how reconciliation is an individual and it's also a collective enterprise. Do you have any suggestions for us who are individuals here? Things that would be important for us to do that might help drive the collective move to reconciliation?
Well, I'll say this, that, and some of you may know, I actually sit on the board of the CBC Radio Canada. So I really care about it because I really do believe in public broadcasting as a as a as a principled piece of democracy. It's why I did work in South Africa, is around that, is trying to make sure that we have an unfettered way to talk to each other and to reflect each other and to make our whole country be a single country. And I'm certainly not going to be one who says, and we do that perfectly every day. No, I would never say that. But I do think that it would be good for you to understand why we zeroed in on CBC Radio Canada and APTN, because those are both publicly funded media outlets. And because the government was the big defendant in this court case, and because it has made promises to do better, and because it has made commitments to ongoing reconciliation, it follows that all of the agencies, all the public service areas where we live and work and experience our country, whether that's the medical system or the educational system or the media system, that there's work there for everyone to do. And what I always say is, and by the way, that work is not for those institutions to do in and of themselves. We own all those things. Like, we are the citizens of this country. That is our public broadcaster. That is our healthcare system. That is our school system. And I think one of the things we do to our peril is to vote once and fall asleep for 4 years. I think we have to stay awake, and I think we have to demand what is expected of us. Yes, I heard a lot of hand-wringing when we thought the whole CBC was going to be killed, but I didn't hear tons of public outcry saying, don't do that, and that won't work for us, and so on. So, we are quietly outraged, and I think we have to be respectfully, for sure, but confidently and courageously engaged in speaking up for those things that we think really matter, and not assume that they will be okay if we say nothing and do nothing. That's why we targeted those two media. I happen to think that the challenge of reconciliation and proper reflection belongs to all media, and I can tell you that in many parts of the world, private broadcasters also have been very interested. Some of the few remaining newspapers in your region have been very interested. So it's not only the public broadcaster, but we were trying to offer calls to action where we felt there was accountability that we could hold up without trying to suddenly get in the way of a private company's business.
So I've had my chance to ask questions, and so we'd like to open it up to anyone here today who has a question. And I think what we'll do, Marie, we have only one portable mic. Is that right? Yeah, or this one. And so we're just trying to decide how to handle the mics. If anyone has a question, it might be best to come to this microphone. Everyone's glued to their seat.
Well, the other way is I'm very happy to run around with a microphone, so I've done that lots of times. No, I wouldn't. I'd just stay down there and run across.
Hello, my name is Barbara Dilla. I have a question that relates to languages. How, with all the hearings that you had, did the survivors communicate? Because I imagine not all of them spoke English or French. So how did you manage with translators, given the very many, many, many languages that exist in the Indigenous communities?
So wherever we went in the country, we always worked in advance with a cultural advisory committee that the community identified, like who should be talking to, who can guide us on proper protocols, who can guide us on proper and most respectful venues, who can provide us on, who can provide food and those practical things, and what will we need to do by way of language facilitation. So if people said, you'll have a lot of first language speakers in Cree or in Inuktitut or in Dene languages or Anishinaabe, we had translators. We had translation systems, and one of the things actually that's great about my long life in the North is that's a very common practice. It's something we used to have, sadly less need for it now, but we used to have, our legislature has built-in translation boxes for 10 different dialects. And so it's, we just arranged for that. We wanted people to be able to speak to us however they felt most comfortable. So that was to do with language. It also was to do with their form of expression. Most people spoke, but some people chose to offer a piece of art or a carving, or in one case, a documentary that someone had done that they wanted to be their statement. So we tried to make it be inclusive in that way, and we also tried to make it so that if anyone just felt they could not speak publicly, we also had a means for people to do private statements and to not have to face kind of a big room. And we also made it possible for people to tell us whether they wanted to be recorded or not, whether they wanted their audio recorded or their picture recorded. So we tried to be as flexible as possible and to really respond to what the individual survivor might need, but also what the community guided us was a proper way to go about our business there.
Thank you.
I will just say, since you raised the question about language, that come on up, is that one of the biggest recurring themes in statements was loss of language, and children talking about arriving somewhere and only speaking their own language, having no means of communicating because they were not allowed to speak it. So rendered silent, literally, for however long it took them to get the basic words they needed. And some of those words, for some cases, were Latin because it was prayers. And so that was a recurring theme. Loss of language is one of the reasons why one of our calls to action is for the creation of an Indigenous Language Commission, which does now exist in Ottawa, and for Indigenous languages to be recognized with official status.
My name is Mario Zeroni. You are here at a very opportune time because I've struggled with truth and reconciliation a lot more because of my closeness to a family member who's from South Africa who went through a very painful and similar process, and here in Canada that I am aware of it. But it's not been very painful for me. It's a confession that I make, and my question has to do with that I am of Italian background, that I've lived in the city of Toronto for most of my life, and we lived in an area called Thorncliffe Park, where it consisted of practically every country that is in the United Nations, that everybody lived there. My question is that in that context of that multicultural society that we have here in North America, in Canada, how do we make a fit with all the people that may either not be aware, not concerned, or how should I think about that? Because I am confused. I'm looking for answers.
Well, I think that's a really important question, and thank you for that, Mario. Can I just, before I answer it, can I just say that I was billeted last night and stayed with Mario and Mary and was so beautifully received and welcomed there. And I want to say something. I'm going to answer your question. But Mario, you don't know that I feel this way, but Mario gifted me with, he's a wood turner, you may know that. He makes all these beautiful bowls, and I was commenting on one that I thought was so particularly beautiful yesterday, but he doesn't know what drew me to that one. And this morning he gifted me with it. But it was a bowl made out of a burl. And what I love about it, you know, is when you see burls in nature, as Catherine and I did yesterday, it looks quite ugly and deformed in the natural state. And it's like it's been rejected by the tree. And it's clinging, it's hanging on. And I just think that's such a powerful metaphor for how we take something like that, that's just clinging to attachment there and trying to be part of something bigger and more vibrant, that it's possible to turn it into something so beautiful, and that it has that potential, to be able to see that potential and then to act, you know. So that's how I see that, and it's actually a metaphor as so much of, there's a chapter in the book called New-Eyed Seeing, where I talk about how I see everything kind of through that lens now. That's how the experience changed me in that way, how I see things. But there's an example of that. To your question, first of all, we have to understand, yes, it's one of our hallmarks as a country that we are a multicultural country. But we are also, why did we do ceremony this morning? Because wherever we live in our multicultural nature, we live on someone's indigenous homeland. And there's a big distinction between indigenous rights and multiculturalism. And one of them is recognized and protected in the highest law in the country, which is the Canadian Constitution. And the other is the welcome open door mat that has been laid out for people for hundreds of years, including a welcome, the original welcome by Indigenous nations, you know, who used to own the whole house and have been relegated to the basement in most places and told, you know, and don't come up unless we tell you. So we don't see that. And I think we have to be advocates for what is right and fair and just. And we have to understand that distinction. We have to not expect Indigenous people to teach us about that all the time. We have to do our own work. And one of the lucky things, partly as a result of the commission, there's now a wealth of beautiful Indigenous literature. There's all kinds of academic work that's being done on the issue of rights and constitutional provisions. And the UN Declaration, which is not impossible to read, it's 40 some odd, I forget, 42 I think it is, provisions within the UN Declaration. They're readable and they're understandable. And there's not a thing in there that you would see as being not what you would expect for your own self and your own families and your own children. It's not like anybody's asking for anything extra. It's recognition of those things that should have been self-evident. And Indigenous rights are something that we're still getting our heads around. What does that actually mean? But it doesn't mean our starting position is to put our hands up and say, no, you can't do that as a starting position. It means, no, we have to come together, start talking to each other and listening to each other and deepening our own understanding and our own humility about how things have been and how they could be if we're going to be the kind of welcoming and truly kind and exceptional country that we claim we are.
Thank you for that perspective. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
My name is Michael. Thank you for coming, first of all. Thank you so much. My question to you, as I know your background as an educator, if you were given the means to be able to bring our Indigenous story, and this is a chapter in the Indigenous story, how would you like to be able to see that implemented into the educational system in Canada?
Well, I can't answer it in a prescriptive way. But in an approach way, what I'll tell you is what I know has happened and exists. And one of the things I was just told this morning And I think this is one piece of it, is an expectation, please stop me if I'm wrong, but that at the University of Prince Edward Island, all graduating students are expected to have done a course of study in some field of indigeneity, I don't know whether it can be anything. I just learned of that this morning. So that could be one piece. The issue is what's in the courses. I think that too is really important. And I'm a huge believer in the value of co-creation. And the reason I say co-creation is not because I think non-Indigenous people have to keep their hand in. It's because some of the skills, the very tools that Indigenous people have been deprived of or have not had access to may not be there, but also because I think the process itself is so valuable for people to have a chance to finally work together. I'll give you an example. First of all, I'll give you two examples. In the field of education, where I live in the Northwest Territories, as you said, for university graduation, where we live, it's high school graduation. You cannot graduate high school without having done a mandatory course, credited course. It used to be after school, optional, non-credited, that sort of cultural activity sort of thing, as if it was pretty darn optional and not very valuable, you know? It's not that, and the course of study that they do was co-created by survivors of residential schools from multiple nations where we live, and educators who are curriculum development specialists, who actually know, like, how do you prepare a lesson plan and how much time do you need and what's the range of activity and what's the attention span of a kid and so on. And there's not necessarily one answer to that, but the process of putting it together is the real magic, because it's where two different kinds of expertise can begin to respect each other instead of one lording over the other or pretending that the other doesn't even exist. And so a more recent example that I've been made aware of, which is not in the context of the schools, but what I just said about the schools applies to all sectors, I was in a jurisdiction, it doesn't matter which jurisdiction in the country, where the judges, the judiciary, was trying to take their calls to action seriously. And they said, you know, we don't have anything like representative reflection of Indigenous lawyers in the judicial cohort. Almost no Indigenous judges. So how do we develop that? And so they decided they would create a mentorship program that's kind of a tag-along approach. Like, it's not just, I'm your mentor, let's chat every month or something, or every couple of weeks. It's, let's be, you know, joined at the hip during the course of work. I don't know how long they devote to that, whether it's, you know, 2 weeks or a month, or I don't know what it is. And so who would like to sign up for that? And they had to have willing judges who were willing to be the mentors, and they had to have willing law students who were aspiring eventually to be on some judicial council or other. Well, that actually is not the story. The story is every single one of those judges reported that the most valuable part of the process was not at all what they conveyed, but what they learned from the Indigenous lawyers, and the richness, the enrichment of experiencing a very different perspective and approach to what is law, which sometimes is a very long ways from what is justice, and what is redemption, and what is forgiveness, you know. Yeah. So I think if we get outside of ourselves and don't start from the place of, okay, who are our experts and let's figure this out, but rather, who's in the room, and are we talking to new voices and new perspectives, and including those things in ways that will help us come up with new ideas and new suggestions and new possibilities. And I think there's incredible power and beauty in that.
Wonderful, thank you, thank you.
Irene Doyle. I'd like to comment on what Kathy said about the CBC not being interested. The interesting thing is that we, the settlers, think that we're number one, and everybody else falls beyond that. I brought up with my friends and acquaintances, how do we actually learn a little bit about what the Indigenous people went through? So actually, I got a list of children's books, starting from reading children's books up to now I'm reading the marrow thieves, when they steal everything but your dreams. Now they're back at the marrow, taking the bone marrow out of you. So I think my question is, how do we change the CBC? The people who are making the decision in Charlottetown are just settlers like the rest of us, and they don't want to hear about it. But it's an important story. And so how do we change that whole thing?
Well, as I said before, I don't have a prescriptive answer to that, and I don't live here. I don't receive your version of CBC service, but I do know that when community voices speak up, I think there are still people in the CBC that try to listen. So maybe you convene a conversation like this, and you ask your questions of somebody who is in your local CBC who can talk about these things, but maybe also you make sure that you have Indigenous friends and colleagues and neighbors as part of that conversation as well. That might be a way to go. I'm a huge believer, and it was a big part of what we did, ties into one of your earlier questions. We tried to convene space. We tried to be very clear and explain what it was we were doing, which was very different from the South African TRC, by the way. It was about education. Our TRC was fundamentally about educating the country. And we tried to make it so that people felt safe to be there, that they felt culturally respected to be there, that they were well cared for with practical needs, that their stories and any tears that got shed in the process, as someone was saying, were honored. And that there was care for them afterwards as well. But when it came down to what actually happened in the rooms, the commissioners said our opening remarks, and then we got quiet and we listened. So sometimes I think it's just that, having a framing question, a framing challenge, and creating the space, and then listening, as opposed to attacking and judging and blaming and all of that. Because most of the time we don't have the full picture, and we need to be aware of that. I do know this, and this I'll say absolutely. I've never had a CBC colleague from all my years in there, nor on the board, that doesn't care tremendously about the organization and about the importance of it. Whether or not people get it executed perfectly, whether or not they've had adequate resources to fulfill the dreams they might have of what they would like to do, those are different things. But I think the intention and the commitment and the will, the goodwill of purpose is there. So then how do you go from that? Yeah. But if you care about this issue, that's what I would say about that, and encourage you to do so.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marie, for this. We're so happy to have you here. I think we're going to wrap it up. I'm going to invite you to meet with our friends from Bookmark, who have provided copies of Marie's wonderful book. I'd like to thank the folks from Spring Park who helped to organize. You know who you are. Do you want a last word, Marie?
So I'll say this, because I always feel kind of shy about, please buy my book. But it isn't about my book. It's about our story. That's what I really want you to understand. It's about our story. And I encourage many people to say, think about, what are you teaching your children and your grandchildren, and what are they learning in their schools? And how well equipped are their teachers? And do they need another tool that could help them do some of the teaching that they're being asked to do? My book is not age appropriate for 7 and 8 year olds, but 7 and 8 year olds are eventually going to be, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. So there are things that can be waiting for them for when they're ready. But meanwhile, you can become the good storytellers who help them start to understand, because children can relate to injustice. How would you feel if someone took you away from your home and your brothers and sisters? Children understand those things if we tell them in a proper way. And I think the reason I say start with those young ones, we consulted with a lot of young people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and we asked them, when is age appropriate? Because no one wants to do any harm. These are not easy stories. And they said, you should start when kids are in grade 3 or 4, because that's when the bullying starts. I thought that was very profound advice from kids. So they want to know and they want to learn, and they don't want to grow up to be 16-year-olds who are mad because nobody ever told them anything about this. And you'll see a story about that in the book. So, so please, if you feel inclined to buy a book, receive it as your book, as our book, as a book that needs to keep talking long after my voice gives out and when all the commissioners are gone. You know, the book has to keep talking, and I hope you'll see it in that way. So thank you very much.
Thank you.